Iawn da, Janet Laugharne ydw i, awdur casgliad barddoniaeth Greenscapes and Other Poems, sydd wedi cael ei cyhoeddi llynedd gan Erbache Press, gwasg yn Lerpwl. Mae'r casgliad yn dilyn, really, un flwyddyn mewn y rhan gyntaf, sef mae'n dechrau yn y Gwanwyn, a gorffen yn y Gwanwyn, ac yn dilyn y blwyddyn fel yna. Wedyn yr ail rhan yn rhan sy'n ganolbwyntio ar dŵr fel elfen. Felly dyna'r sort of patrwm y casgliad fel yn ei sort of cyfan gwbl.
Bonjour, je suis Sophie Buchaillard, une auteure romancière franco-britannique qui vit au Pays de Galles depuis 25 ans, et l'auteur de This Is Not Who We Are, publié par Seren Books, qui est un livre sur la relation entre le Rwanda et la France pendant le génocide de 1994. Et mon deuxième roman sera publié par les éditions Ono l'année prochaine, en 2024. Et le livre s'intitule Assimilation. Et l'histoire de 3 générations de femmes françaises et leur relation à la migration et au voyage. Janet, we've known each other quite a while now.
We have. In fact, we started our we first met when we were doing yoga together, didn't we?
We did, yes. We used to go on yoga retreats together.
We did, and that was lovely. Another form of creativity in itself, and thinking about life and important things, having a space out of life to do that, which obviously, when one's writing, one goes into those sort of deep places to find ideas and write. So yes, we did. And of course, years later, then we met in the writing sort of sphere, didn't we?
Yes, we did, yes. And so you live in Cardiff still, and you're Professor Emerita in Education, having spent your career in language education and Welsh-English bilingualism.
That's right, yes,
so
yes.
Can you tell me about that? I never knew that way.
Oh, right, yes, I did, yes. Well, basically, I started learning Welsh as an adult when I was at university, actually, and I sort of carried on sort of learning, and I was very fascinated by the process of learning to speak another language, particularly Welsh. And sort of in my 40s, this is a long way around getting back to the writing, but there is a link. In my 40s, I did a PhD in children's oral storytelling about in Welsh medium schools, about their experience of various events. They chose a story to tell in Welsh about things that had happened at home and things that had happened at school. And the idea was that the effect of the language domain might have an effect on the language that they were using. But anyway, it was a fascinating study. I really enjoyed it. It was really interesting. But that, of course, is a long piece of writing. As you know, a PhD is a long piece of writing. And really, I've been doing a lot of writing in my professional sort of world anyway, really, but mostly using those skills, those sort of craft writing skills for sort of non-fiction, sort of, academic writing. So I can't remember what you asked me now, but I think that may roughly reply.
Yes, it was just asking about your professional career.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
I do teach creative writing class, and I find there's a lot of academic people come to the classes because they find the creative writing a break from academic writing.
Exactly.
So is that how you came to writing poetry?
No, not really, because I have written creatively all my life. So some of the poems in my collection go back a very long time. I mean, some of them written maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So I have written creatively alongside what you might call my work writing. Yes. But I didn't really think about writing creatively in a more sustained way until I had more time, really, because it's very difficult, as we all know, to have enough time with family commitments, full-time work, research in the case of academic study, to have the space and energy to do the creative writing. So a lot of my creativity and my creative writing was, in my working life, was focused on my academic non-fiction writing, really. So, but but I was writing creatively for my own pleasure and have done all my life. So,
Yes.
yeah.
And of course you have, you grew up in a creative family as well, so you've always had this
Yes,
in the background.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, my father was an Anglo-Welsh writer. He wrote in English, although Welsh was originally his first language. So I was very much involved in the writing world as a child. I mean, it seemed very natural that writing would be something you do. You know, it was very much a part of life, really, very much so. I mean, he had a study. He would go into that study, and you didn't disturb him, you know, as because it was very much a focused thing that he was doing. So, and obviously some of the sort of sides of that, seeing, you know, hearing about things that were published, seeing the end product, seeing the book. You know, it's very exciting as a child to be. It seemed very natural, but it was very exciting to be part of that sort of world, really.
Would you have a lot of artists and maybe writers and poets coming to the house as well?
Yes, yeah, not so much poets actually, because my father was a prose writer, so probably not so many poets, but certainly people involved in the creative writing world, you know, so publishers, other writers, and we've discovered recently the amount of volume of correspondence that he had with other people. So that was, you know, of course, he was of that era where writing letters was part of the way you communicated. You know, I mean, now it would be emails and heaven knows what, you know. But but he so. And his correspondence is kept in the archive in the National Library of Wales. Yes. So it's and we've recently, myself and my sister, been investigating some of that life that as a child one just thought was natural and that you were sort of part of. But certainly, yes, writing is very much a natural thing to me, you know, in all its forms. I think, you know, I sort of see it as a craft skill. So whatever you're writing, you need to bring those skills to it, really.
Yes.
You know.
Because you also write, you've had a novel published as well. And
yes.
In your name and various other projects.
Yes, that's right.
A little bit about that.
Yes. Well, it's the novel is a co-written novel, so that in itself was an exciting thing to be creating a big piece of work with somebody else. And that was a very, very exciting project, and that sort of came to fruition last year, and in a sort of a contemporary women's fiction novel called What Lies Between Them. Yes. And we had this, Jackie and myself, who sort of co-wrote the novel, have this sort of pen name that we created, a composite of both our names, J.L. Harland. And so that was a wonderful thing, and that's an ongoing thing. The J.L. Harland co-writing stuff is an ongoing thing. Yes. But I also write prose individually, and I have a novel that's there, yes. And I'm in the process of starting a second one at the moment, which is very exciting. I was doing very well at it, and then a couple of things happened, and so I have to go back to it. But it's a very different process in some ways, as you know yourself, because I think you're interested in both prose and poetry. And it's a different process, isn't it? I don't know what thoughts you have. I mean, I don't know if we're interviewing each other or not, but I don't know what thoughts you have about that, because it's fascinating to engage in both, because certain things are very similar, but others are so different, aren't they, really?
Yes, well, I mean, I'm only starting in with poetry, but I have found certainly that it seems to use a different part of the brain, and there's a different energy attached to it. And at times when I felt I didn't have the mental space to write a novel because there was too much going on, too many projects and too many competing activities, I think the self-contained nature of a poem made it almost like a respite from the stress of daily life, to sit and then write a poem.
Absolutely.
And be able to quickly then return to it and edit it.
Yes.
In a way that you can't really do with a novel so easily. Exactly.
There's an intensity about it, and an encapsulation of something, isn't there?
Yes.
You know, and obviously the editing, that's something that goes across both, doesn't it? You know, I mean, you edit in a novel and edit a poem. You know, that's a very similar thing, to try and hone the thing so it's as good as you can make it, polish, change. In my view, anyway. I mean, some people perhaps think differently about poetry, but I certainly very much see it as something that you keep on working on until you've got it as good as you can make it.
Very much so. And so this collection, Greenscapes and Other Poems, as you said earlier, spans quite a long period of time. And I was interested in, there's places that you revisit at different moments in time. Did you see there's a sort of progression, encapsulates a lifetime of experiences?
Well, I think there's sort of two ways of answering that, really, because on the one hand, this is my first collection of poetry, and therefore it represents, as I say, work that I've been doing for a very long period of time, but hadn't had published specifically. So in that sense, it covers a long period of time. But on the other hand, I feel it's very much a pandemic collection, because a lot of the poems are also reflecting on the pandemic and the experience that I and everybody else was going through at that time. And I think there's some qualities in it which come from that point in time, to my mind.
Yes, very much so. And I think reading the collection, and maybe because I know you as well, and because of the manner in which we met, I very much got the sense that a lot of the poems are grounded in the place and a moment and feel very meditative. And there's that sense of reflection and almost nostalgia sometimes as well.
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of people were going through those sorts of experiences, really, in one form or other during the pandemic, because a lot of us were on our own in ways that we weren't either with immediate family or people we were living with, but often we were spending large periods of time much more on our own than perhaps we had in the past. And so I think there's that aspect. And also the other thing that I felt about some of the poems is that they did come from walking the city. So but it was walking during the pandemic. So it was often quite, you didn't speak to people necessarily. You saw people, you sort of acknowledged each other perhaps, but you didn't sort of meet and speak in ways you might have done in more normal or more usual times, let's say. So.
Yes, and I think certainly my experience is that time was also a moment to reconnect with nature because of that. Because we spend a lot of time walking in what often was quite a limited range of
the 1 hour's radius.
Yes, 1 hour's
the
radius.
1 hour's radius.
I find that I noticed a lot more about the nature around where I lived than I had in the past.
Yes, because one was inevitably slowed down. You weren't going on an 8-mile hike or something necessarily, unless you were a very fast walker. In the hours sort of recreation, let's say. So one was slowing down, and that in itself allowed opportunities to notice things. But I've sort of always done that to an extent, in that having grown up in the country in quite a remote part of North Wales, I think I've always looked for a bit of country in the city, and of course Cardiff is quite fortunate in there are quite a lot of green, alleyways and sort of, links between parks and green areas and things. So you can go for quite a green walk, using cuttings and side, little sort of shortcuts and things, and quite a lot of green space, really, more than one might think with just focusing on the parks. There's often connections between them.
Very much so. I grew up in Paris, and whenever some of my French relatives came to visit Cardiff, they've always commented on the fact that it was a lot greener than they expected. I think Cardiff is often seen as an industrial city.
Indeed.
That has been framed by the industrial landscape, but it is surprisingly green.
It is, and some of that is thanks to the sort of the wealthy coal owners.
Yes.
So ironically, but yes. We are benefiting in that sense from it. And the river as well is lovely, having sort of as many cities, but the River Taff and the city is a lovely sort of feature, I think. So yes, going back to your original sort of comment or question, I think I like to think that the collection goes back over quite a long period of time, because of the nature of it being a first publication of work that's being carried out for over a very long period of time. But also I think it's focused in a very specific point in time, which was the pandemic, or just coming out of the pandemic.
Yes. It seems like a good point to ask you to read maybe a first poem.
Oh,
yes,
okay,
a
thank
sense
you.
Of the collection.
Yes, I will. I'd be very happy to do that. And the first poem I thought I'd read is the last poem in part one. The poetry collection is in two parts. Part one is very much about the greenness within the city. You know, it's sort of green in the city. And then part 2 is about water in one form or another. But this is the last poem at the end of the first half of the poetry collection. It's called Leaving. And the leaving is referring to the allotment. The allotment and the allotment lane it features in several poems in this first half. Because I had an allotment for many years, and so it's got a very personal connection to the sort of digging of the earth and growing things and so on. But this is about somebody that I observed in springtime leaving his allotment, and it's called Leaving. The metal scrape of the gate over tarmac dipping on its hinges. A diesel throb as the car appears, door opening to voices of Radio 4. And the driver rolls out, key in hand, to pause at the communal lock. Sometimes oiled, sometimes not, rarely easy to close. Reversing, a 3-point turn and he's off, back to his everyday. Just that linger of green in the car, that smell of earth, lettuce and runner bean. In the lane, the bird song, leaves rustle, gusts of wind, empty as so often of people. No other sound. Just wind and bird song in this Cardiff lane, complete in sun.
That's lovely, thank you.
You're very welcome.
I think it's a poem that connects to another aspect of the collection for me, which is the witnessing. There's a lot about nature, the lockdown, life in Wales, the Arab Spring. There's Donald Trump features in one of the poems. There's a sense of a snapshot of that moment in time where I guess we were forced into a position of observers a lot more than we often are from lack of action. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit about that.
Yes. I think I probably am more of an observer. I'm a natural observer, so I think that comes with the territory of my particular sort of temperament, really. So I enjoy observing and seeing things, and some of it is the natural world, and some of it is obviously the broader sort of societal things that are happening. But yes, I mean, I think if you're writing in poetry or prose, observation is a key sort of thing to bring to bear, and hopefully offer something that's fresh or sort of well observed, or gives something for the reader to enjoy. So I think that's something I hope I do in this, is to give some observations that give some pleasure or interest to the reader, really.
Yeah, very much so. And I think a lot of the poems keep going back to the allotment. And I had, as I was reading the collection the first time, I read it several times, this image of you sitting in a shed writing your poems. So what was the process? How did you go out, observe, and then go home and write a poem, or was there a delay? What sort of creative process did you follow?
Well, I certainly didn't write in the allotment, because my time was so parcelled out, because at that point I was working, I had the family, etc. So I was in the allotment, I was working on the allotment, digging away and planting and weeding, etc. So not at that time.
No.
And in fact, quite a lot of the poems actually are sort of based on observations and experiences from, well, some are quite recent, some were last spring. So they do vary, but the actual writing is sometime after the sort of event, let us say, you know. So I tend to write at home, really. It's sort of, you know, and the process is usually writing by hand. In a notebook, so unlined. I don't like lines. So and then working from the sort of handwritten form then into a an online sort of document, and then editing, reading aloud, and editing. That's the sort of process.
It's a process. And do you have a reader in mind when you write the poems, or are you writing the poems primarily for yourself?
I don't have a reader as such, but hopefully somebody who enjoys poetry, you know, somebody who's going to read it with a poet's, an enjoyment of poetry, and I suppose there is an element of it being sort of, you know, I'm a Welsh writer, so I think there's an element of sort of musicality in it, which I think might be a Celtic thing, you know. There's quite a lot of assonance and things like that. So I think that might be a sort of an element that comes into which hopefully I would hope a reader would enjoy, really. But I don't have a specific reader in mind, just hopefully somebody who's going to enjoy reading a collection which is particularly about the natural world, I suppose, the natural world in an urban setting. I mean, that's I suppose the title hopefully gives the clue what somebody might find if they read it.
Very much so. And in terms of the Welsh language, I mean, you obviously professionally you have studied and researched the Welsh language throughout your career in academia. And I'm very aware that in Welsh poetry there are very different forms, very defined forms. And has that informed your poetry writing at all?
Well,
do you read poetry in Welsh as well?
I don't read poetry in Welsh. No. I'm that again comes from my learning of the language as an adult. So I didn't grow up speaking Welsh as my first language. It's a second language, or a language that I acquired as a sort of an adult. So I don't think I have the technical knowledge to really appreciate Welsh poetry. Though we can enjoy a certain amount, but not to really appreciate it in the same way as I might appreciate poetry in English, because I have the sort of linguistic ability to understand exactly what, or more closely what somebody intends in English. Though in fact my grandfather was a Welsh poet, funnily enough, and my mother's father was a Welsh poet, so I probably did hear some of his poetry as a child, read aloud, but not I wouldn't have read it in written form, but I'd have heard it probably occasionally. So, but no, I mean, I think in terms of the sort of techniques of Welsh poetry, I don't think there's anything explicitly there that's in my poetry. I just feel that perhaps some of the sort of musicality, as I said before, of the Welsh language might be in it. So
certainly a very strong Celtic tradition.
It is. Yes. It is.
If I can focus on specifically, you have 3 poems that are specifically on gnomes, which is. I was struck by the way you blend the eye of a painter when describing the gnome in the poem with the sensitivity of the wordsmith, and drawing the eye to the minute details of those garden sculptures, and it's almost meditative in quality.
Yes, well, I did have a sort of a patch where I was going around looking at ornaments in gardens on my walk, again, the sort of pandemic walk, and I got quite a bit obsessive about garden gnomes, looking at it, and other furnishings in gardens, because it was really quite strange. I mean, it's surprising. What people put in their front gardens, particularly. Who knows what was in their back gardens? Obviously, I wasn't going to investigate their back gardens particularly, but this is sort of on display. As you went to the front of somebody's house, there would be these creatures.
Yes, and
I found them quite fascinating, really. And I went on a few walks when I specifically was hunting for gnomes.
Yes.
And I found quite as I say, there are 3 gnome poems, so I found 3 at least.
Inspiration. Yeah, I find it an amazing expression of what people are trying to convey about themselves by putting a statue of a gnome in their front garden.
Yes.
So what sort of gnome is it, and what that says about someone?
I know.
It's fascinating.
It is. And this one gnome 1, the poem Gnome 1, I found particularly sad, really, because there was this garden gnome that it was a vast amount. The whole building, it was a bungalow, was being sort of raised to the ground. There was a gate. There was just a gate, no walls, no sort of side, no sort of side entrance. And so you could see into this rubble, which is where the bungalow had been. And there was a garden gnome lying on its side there. And it just. I thought, goodness, just so strange to see it there amongst this absolute, devastation, really. So. The owners obviously I presume the owners had long gone, long died perhaps, and this was being, rebuilt. So in and of itself, it was going to be a new building, but who knows what was the fate of the garden gnome.
Yes. I think 15 years ago, 20 years ago probably by now, I did some work at the Heath Hospital, and the students, the nursing students, had gone around and stolen gnomes from people's front garden and put them all on the rooftop in a courtyard. And because of where it is, nobody can access the courtyard. So if you go, there's an inner courtyard somewhere in the Heath Hospital where there's dozens of garden gnomes.
I had no idea that not only have we got this yoga connection, we've got a gnome connection
We do
as well.
have a gnome connection. It's fascinating because it's not immediately obvious how they got there.
No. Because that's the thing. Because the thing about gnomes is that they are sort of a bit akin to human, aren't they? They're akin because they're often dressed, and they're a form of. They're a form of human. It's a bit like some people, of course. It's a bit like clowns. Some people have quite a phobia, don't they, of clowns? And I think maybe you can extend that to an extent to gnomes, so that they seem a bit less harmless because they're out in the great outdoors. If you had them in the house, maybe they'd be a bit more sinister. I don't know. I don't know what the nurses made of those gnomes.
So would you treat us to a gnome poem?
Oh, a gnome poem. Yes, a gnome poem. Wait a minute, let me find it. Gnome. I'm going to read you Gnome 2 because you mentioned about observing sort of artistic detail, and I think that's the one that has more sort of colour, let's say, in it in a way.
Yes.
So this, as I say, it's a set of 3 poems about garden gnomes. This is Garden Gnome 2. And this one I spotted several times, so that was, unlike the one in the house that was being destroyed. I think I only saw it once and then it had gone, But I've been watching this gnome. He's looking down as though in a gallery, just by the rounds of dark wood ends, from the palisade which makes the raised bed with one blue eye. He's been painted. Bright red hat and yellow waistcoat, with a dark blue jacket, pointed ears, and a weather-pitted face. The cheerful colours, his still one-eyed gaze as the seasons change, catch me every time, slowing my steps, walking by.
Thank you. And so in the collection also you have some poem which I thought conveyed very joyful moments, which I suppose at the time of the pandemic we would have been looking for those particularly, and then the two that struck me particularly were the one, there's one about a small girl.
Yes, in the rainy day.
Rainy day, and the other one about a dragon.
Oh, yes, red dragon hunting.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think, again, like all of us, it was a mixture of longing and melancholy and hope that perhaps, we would emerge from this in some form of life again, but get back to normal is a strange word to use really, because I think now I think we are reluctant to talk about I don't think we take anything for granted now, do we? We're having been through the pandemic. I think one has a much more awareness that of what what can possibly happen, and clearly that's from a very privileged position of having, certainly in my generation, post Second World War, not having experienced a war close at hand. So, but certainly the vast uncertain, the huge element of things coming apart, as T.S. Eliot, I've misquoted him, but that sense of chaos.
Yes.
So I think in that, against that, one naturally, where you see moments of hope, you rejoice in those.
Yes, you put things into perspective, and I guess for a lot of people, and I'm sure particularly for working people in some cases, it was the opportunity to take stock and reassess what was important as well.
I think so. I very, very much so. I think sort of reassessing what was important, and also use of time, because I think that's another thing. I think that's a big thing that's come from the pandemic, because people are not willing necessarily to waste time in a way perhaps they might have felt forced to do before. So I think a lot of re-evaluation of life and what one does with one's life has come out of the pandemic.
Very much so. And so you talked about your novel writing. Are you writing new poems alongside the novel?
I am writing new poems, but not so much alongside the novel, because I tend to find if I'm, which hopefully I will get back into writing the novel that I started, that'll take a lot of my energy and concentration. And probably I won't, I'd never say never, but most likely, because this business again of juggling time, and given the fact I co-write as well, so it's a sort of a bit of a juggling act with one's time. I think the chances of writing new poetry, if I want to particularly focus on these other aspects, is something that is slim, really. I think I'm less likely to be writing, but I've got poetry that I want to edit, which is another matter. Right. Editing is a different thing. So I have the sort of rudiments of a second collection, and I have the work for a second collection, but I need to edit it and decide the order of it and things like that. So, so that's sort of work in progress with the poetry. But in terms of new material, I think my aim is to carry on with the novel that I started, really, in terms of new work. So
fantastic, thank you. So Janet, we've changed scenery.
Lovely scenery too, beautiful.
The collection is in two parts.
It is.
You've read two poems from the first part of the collection, but you have a third poem first to read. Would you want to tell us a little bit more about the second part of the collection and this poem in particular?
Sure, thanks very much. Yes, I would. The part two is is connected by the theme of water, so literally and metaphorically. So all the poems have got something to do with water in them. And this particular one, and quite a few of them are probably about my younger years, sort of, so this one, which I'm going to read, called Swimming in the Laugharne Estuary, was probably, it came maybe about a few years ago, but it is about when I was a young person in my sort of 20s. So, there's again this sort of points in time. And my mother and I used to go swimming, wild swimming, long before wild swimming was the thing. And we used to swim in the Laugharne Estuary because our house was just on the edge of the Laugharne Estuary. And so this is about that experience of swimming in the Laugharne Estuary. I remember mudflats, tides, eels, they said, the grey sea wall, its cracked cement and steep steps down to the incoming sea. Felt the wobble of stones, green slime and brown weed underfoot getting in. Then, joyous salty buoyancy, a line of silver sun on water, cold, breathtaking water, swimming fast out and back to land, through wind, the flap of wet flip-flops, the clutch of a salt-encrusted towel, back to hot tea and exhilaration.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're very welcome. Croissant.
So you're talking about the editing process for your next collection, I suppose. So I'm as a budding poet myself, I'm interested in the sort of advice that you would give someone who's starting out with poetry. I'm starting to have a body of text, and it's the editing process not quite.
Yes.
How do you edit a poem? I think it's a magic question.
I know, I wish I knew myself. No, but well, I think in terms of editing, if we sort of the budding poet and the editing aspect, I mean, I think writing, I do think it's a bit like, developing a sort of, a muscle, like if you're sort of exercising. So writing quite a bit, and then editing what you've written, and then reading it aloud. These are classic things, and they do pay off. So writing, as much as one can or feels, in whatever form you do it, whether you do it in an intensive burst or every day or periodically or whatever. But writing regularly, probably reading aloud first, probably, and then you will see how you need to edit it. So I think particularly with poetry, although it's not performance poetry, it has to sound right and look right. The sound and the visual has to sort of fit together. And the dreaded things, because obviously this is free verse we're talking about rather than I don't know if you're writing free verse. Well, then obviously things like the line breaks, where you're putting the line break, the punctuation, the sort of white space, how it sits on the page. All those things are fun to play around with, to see what if you want it all as one chunk. If you're going to do it as prose, prose poetry, you know, as a solid block. If you want to sort of divide out the verses in some way. So there's lots of things, you've got a lot of free choice like that to see how best it sits on the page in combination with how it sounds, because they work together.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, and I find it interesting to see how you then translate that into spoken poetry when attending an event. For example, I'm doing an event tomorrow.
Right.
For the first time.
Yes.
Which would be interesting, but it's how when you have a poem that has been specifically crafted to look a certain way on the page, and how you then convey that when speaking the poem, I find quite a challenge.
Yes, I mean, personally speaking, I look at where the breaks come, and I make annotations for myself for when I'm reading it. So I'll put pencil annotations for where I want to pause, and it's usually where the punctuation comes, but it's also to do with your breathing, where you want to take a breath when you're reading it, because sometimes written poetry can be on a very long line, you know, and that can be quite a challenge for your breath, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Whereas if you're perhaps a performance poet, it might come more naturally with your breath, because it's, you know, spoken initially and mainly spoken. So I think that's one thing to look when you're rehearsing it to yourself, to see where the breaks come for meaning and breath. You know, because you can more or less expire trying to read something that sometimes, because, you know, and you have to sort of make sure the meaning's still conveyed, but you can breathe as well, sort of with it. So I would say. But obviously listening to other poets, that's the thing. I mean, you know, it's fantastic. There are so many opportunities to listen to other poets reading their work. And sometimes you'll see the text whilst hearing the poet read, and that can be fascinating too.
So the treatment,
see how they've worked with it. So I think those are things that would strike me, you know, initially, really. And reading, of course, reading poetry, you know, as well as hearing poets read their work, you know, reading it, because it's a different thing reading quietly to yourself, isn't it?
Yes.
Than hearing the poet, because you're then following their interpretation necessarily if they're you know, reading their poem, and you might read it in a different way as a reader. So yes.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure talking to you today, Janet.
Croeso.
Merci beaucoup.
Wel croeso, falch iawn i gael y gyfle i siarad efo ti. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Okay.